Hi, I'm Mark Wasilyu. I'm the MLA for Fort Garry, and welcome to our fourth episode on the Ledge podcast. This podcast is dedicated to all things provincial politics. We have a new leader of the opposition in Abi Khan, and we'll be talking this week about how the vibe has changed in the legislature. We also have part two of our great interview with Janine Gibson, leader of the Manitoba Green Party, and we'll finish up this week with the latest hot topic at the Ledge. Education property tax bills are coming in the mail. Surprising, lots of Manitobans are seeing a huge jump in both education property taxes and municipal taxes. The PCs have been hammering a very listless Kinew on this issue, and we're going to get into the weeds. So let's get started. So I wanted to talk this week about a noticeable shift in the vibe in the House after Abi Khan's first week as opposition leader. I had a very interesting discussion with a senior MLA. He'd been in the House for over 25 years, and he's seen premiers come and go. And in his career, he says that under Kinew's Manitoba legislature, he has never seen it so toxic or dysfunctional. And it's the leader that sets the tone. The legislature takes on sort of the personality of the premier. If the premier is respectful, inclusive, and welcoming, so too will be the legislature. But if the premier is hyperpartisan, petty, mean-spirited, contemptful, the legislature will take on that personality. So when people in the NDP, either in the caucus or staff, talk about how it's toxic and dysfunctional at the Ledge or the leader's office, people are going to ask, well, what are they talking about? And so let's explore that today. So how does Kinew behave in the legislature? Well, how does it affect the culture of the place, and why does this matter to you? Well, the culture of the leader is important. So if you characterize the leader's approach, I think in a word, is probably smugness. There's a constant display of contempt for others, especially people he deems as his opposition. And it's a constant stream of demeaning remarks and personal attacks that have nothing to do with policy. And in fact, many of these attacks are very small. Now, he's in fact sort of told on himself, and his attitude in QP is outlined in a talk he gave about dominating his opposition. And I want to give this so you can get a kind of flavor of things that the premier is saying in the House. On April 7th, 2025, the then leader of the opposition, Wayne Owasco, was asking the premier about his assertion that he would end violent crime. Now, Wayne Owasco brought up a stabbing and a robbery that occurred on a Winnipeg transit bus. And of course, instead of answering the question, which was the whole point of question period, the premier began to opine on the state of the PC leadership race between Abi Khan and Wally Doddridge. So here's the exact quote from Kinew, who's, remember, answering a question about his government's policy on violent crime. And I quote, "I'm interested about Wally. He's the one that I haven't dominated in QP yet, so bring him on. Let's see what Wally," and he pronounced it Wally, "has to bring when it comes to the members opposite," close quote. So serious question posed to the premier, doesn't answer. He talks about something completely irrelevant and has nothing to do with him, the PC leadership race. And then this is the key point. He talks about dominating people in question period. Now think about that for a second. That's not normal. That's the premier of Manitoba talking about dominating somebody he works with. In any other context, you would get fired. Then he refers to a leadership candidate. He makes fun of his name. He demeans him by mispronouncing in kind of a childish way, and then talks about potentially a future leader of the oppositions. Now, MLAs are all watching this. And keep in mind, there's no on-the-job training for an MLA, and nobody knows how to do the job. And how you learn is basically watching more experienced MLAs and emulating that. So you have sort of impressionable new MLAs who are watching the premier talk and act like this and treat his opposition in this way. So what message does that send? Well, you don't have to do your job and hold yourself accountable by actually answering questions to the people of Manitoba. You are trying to dominate your opponent, and that seems to be the real purpose of question period. The third thing is that your opponent is your enemy. and they're not worthy of your respect, and you can show them contempt. And fourth, that it's perfectly acceptable to demean and disrespect Manitobans. Manitobans who want to enter politics to provide a public service, instead they are made fun of and belittled when they're there to act on behalf of their vision of Manitoba and the people that sent them. So this is something that Kinew routinely would do. He would comment on how lazy the opposition is, and he would quote Wally Doddridge, who made some inflammatory comments about the PC caucus. He would claim that opposition MLAs haven't asked questions in 6 months and basically aren't doing their jobs, and they weren't earning their salaries. And he would demean Wayne Owasco, referring to him as the so-called leader of the PCs. Now, he would take quotes out of context for political cheap shots. And one of the ones that you would hear quite often that he would repeat is about Obby Khan. Now, Obby Khan went on a podcast, and the interview asked him how much influence the tariff threat had on Justin Trudeau's leaving. Khan's quote is this, quote, and I'll do it in full, "A lot. And I would say thank you. He's gone now," meaning Trudeau. "Now we just need to get rid of WAB and unleash Manitoba," end quote. That's the full quote. So WAB will then take that quote and misquote it in bad faith and repeatedly and numerously say that Obby Khan thanked Donald Trump for the tariffs. He clearly didn't. So the premier knows this, he's a smart man, and he's clearly doing a bad faith attack on Obby Khan. And despite being called out on it, he continues to repeat it. So why would you distort and mislead people about what your opponent is saying and then double down on it and repeat it even though you know it's not true? How are Manitobans to trust a premier who would do that, who would be fast and loose with the facts and would misrepresent the leader of opposition's positions? So instead of engaging Obby Khan in a battle of ideas, we get this sort of cheap Trump-style, U.S.-style type politics. The other thing that Wab Kinew would do is he doesn't like questions the opposition are asking, and he will basically lecture them about what they should be asking, and he will enter in with his opinions about a PC leadership contest that he had no vote in, and he's upset that PCs would allow independents like myself to ask the premier questions. The theme with all this is that it's always personal. It has nothing to do with the premier's role as the premier, and it's usually meant to distract and deflect. Now, it's fair game to attack your opponent's policy positions, but not them personally. Yet, Kinew's remarks are always personal, always nasty, and always mean-spirited. And it's this kind of unnecessary personal attacks that affect us as Manitobans, because who wants to serve in a legislature where you're opened up to those type of attacks? And basically, it's abusive behavior. The highlight of all this, and the sort of peak of this, is that Wab Kinew couldn't even bring himself to congratulate Obby Khan on his election as opposition leader. And when he was asked by this about the press, the premier's response was basically, well, no one ever reached out and congratulated me. Therefore, it's justified that he wouldn't do it for Obby Khan. And that claim was quickly proven to be false. There was Hansard record of PC MLAs actually congratulating him on the record. And even despite that back and forth with the press, he's still not congratulated Obby Khan on his victory. So, small things, but that sets the tone and people are watching. This premier is the premier of all of Manitoba and speaks for all of us. And he's the public face for Manitoba to the world. So when he acts like that, it reflects on all of us. And that's not what Manitobans expect. They want our premier to be the best of us and to show our best side to the world. If the premier is small and petty and mean-spirited, it makes us all as Manitobans look small, petty, and mean-spirited. That's not who we are, and that's not how we want to be portrayed. All right, and we're back. So it's a great honor today to be joined by Green Party co-leader Janine Gibson. I want to welcome you to the pod.
Thank you. That's very sweet of you.
Well, so bring it back to Manitoba.
Yes.
Is Wab Kinew an environmentalist? Does he run a climate-friendly government?
I don't think so. He may he may like to think that he is, but right from the first time that I was introduced to Mr. Kinew, he did not want to meet my eyes. And I think he knew that I am a very, very, very concerned about our environment here in Manitoba. And I actually, was very active. I was one of the founding members of our Line in the Sand, very active trying to protect our drinking water. My well is in that carbonate aquifer that they wanted to mix up with the Sandylands aquifer, and that provides the only source of drinking water for a lot of families and a lot of businesses in the whole southeast corner of Manitoba. And though he stopped them initially, I think it was like a time out, not a real stop, because he seems to be welcoming them back. So.
Yeah, and I want to get into more of that because I certainly have some personal experience on that file. But arguably, the most consequential environmental policy of the Kinew government to date has been the reduction of 14 cents per liter for the gas tax holiday. It's $340 million of borrowed money that we have to now pay back and pay interest on.
Ooh.
And it obviously has the reverse effect. It actually was detrimental to the environment.
Exactly.
And it was sold to the public as an affordability measure, which again, you got to squint really hard to see that. What's your response to the government doing that?
Well, that doesn't pencil out. To me, it's a sad reflection of their lack of having an involved approach. What kind of consultation, what kind of research did they do into it? Like, it just really seems to be a knee-jerk reaction that's not part of a well-thought-out plan. And to me, it just emphasizes that the Kinew government is not an environmentally based government. They do not see their responsibility, but yet, that I totally have lived my life by that First Nation saying of we need to act in a way that honors 7 generations behind us, because we would not be here today without the hard work of those 7 generations behind us and 7 generations in the future. So he's not respecting that.
And I want to get your take on a number of sort of NDP environmental promises and sort of lay them out and see what you think.
Yes.
Okay. So in the 2023 election, there was an environmental forum. I think you were even there.
Yes, I attended.
And the NDP were asked whether or not they would reinstate the ban on cosmetic pesticides. And they have said that they would. And we're now 2 years into their mandate. So we've gone through 2 cycles of legislative sessions. It's too late to introduce and pass a bill this year. So the earliest,
thank goodness.
Yeah, the earliest they could pass a cosmetic ban would be 2026. And so this government's running out of time. They have 2 more years to do this. They haven't done it. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, have they been influenced by the people that make money when we use those pesticides? If they truly looked at caring for our health, I just can't believe that there are school boards that want to spray Roundup in the schoolyards. It's so damaging to people's kidneys and liver and our cleaning system. Anyway, we've got to demand that they be more responsible. They are just trying to do the bare minimum, I think, in terms of the environment. Because if there was any real concern for the future generations, they would be all over that pesticide ban, because that's who it impacts the most, elders and children.
Okay, so I'm gonna hit you with the big one, the carbon tax. Now, a lot of Manitobans don't remember this history, but Wab Kinew in 2019, prior to that election, said the cornerstone of the NDP environmental policy was to bring in a carbon tax. And he said at the time that if Ottawa got rid of their carbon tax, he would still bring one in to Manitoba. And now he's been one of the biggest anti-carbon tax champions in Canada, and says that he's both opposed to the consumer carbon tax, and he's implied that we're all in Manitoba also against the industrial carbon tax, something that the companies themselves are saying that is a good thing, and it actually helps their businesses trade with Europe and others sort of concerned. So I want to hear your take on all that.
I am really really disappointed in him that he does not want to make the polluters pay, because that's what we have to do, and that's why it has to be corporate. And yet there's so many other things that could help with the high cost of living that doesn't involve supporting petroleum products. That is clearly what we need to be moving away from. It's almost as much head in the sand as Pallister was, really, because we have to stop giving public money to the gas and the oil companies, and hold them accountable for the pollution that they're doing, and be investing. Manitoba has a wonderful opportunity to invest in more regional hydroelectricity, not this ridiculous natural gas that's so polluting. It's crazy. We have an opportunity to do a lot in wind and solar, and we really should be complementing and trying to minimize the destructive impact of using Lake Winnipeg as a catchment basin to the riparian areas around it, and truly supporting, what will make things better, which is not underwriting the cost of using gas. So it's just 100% in the wrong direction, and I'm very disappointed.
Yeah. What are Manitobans to take from a premier who on a Monday is for a carbon tax and then on a Wednesday is now vehemently against it, and has never articulated his transition, why he went from an advocate to a severe opponent? And what does it say about what he's talking about future Manitoba environmental policies, and whether they can trust what this government says on the environment?
Well, I can't trust their use of the current Environment Act. It says that he doesn't have a basis of principle from which he's acting. And to me, that is very important, because we need accountability. And is that not what our government is all about? Is to ensure accountability for what the people need? So, yes, there are a lot of folks that say government has primarily been about protecting the rich and protecting wealth. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the Green Party talks about updating democracy. So it's not just letting the rich stay rich and get richer at the price of the everyday person, the working person, and the environment. But the poor are getting poorer, and the mental health is worse, the addictions are worse. That's really putting a lot of stress on a lot of families. And I'm very disappointed that we could come up with a plan that would really address many issues at the same time: housing, healthcare, food production, alternative. Where were they about losing the buses, losing the gray bus system? I mean, that's isolated so many people in communities.
You're talking about the basically disappearance of intercommunity transit.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
And the province of Saskatchewan used to have a crown corporation that would provide those services, and it got privatized and then disappeared. And then Manitoba, we really have nothing. And the private carriers, there's a few, but it's not a system.
We have a whole, there's so much room for the provincial government to be creative and groundbreaking and combine environmental justice with social justice. There's so many opportunities for that, Mark, and they're being missed.
Okay, so I want to hit you with another one. Brian Pallister, while premier, floated the idea of building an oil pipeline to Churchill to move Alberta oil and gas to potential European markets.
Mm-hmm.
The Churchill community opposed it. There was concerns from environmental groups that there would be spills in very environmentally sensitive areas in the north, in isolated areas that can't necessarily get
cleaned out.
There was issues about First Nations sovereignty and whether they were ever consulted or even included in any of these proposals. And in response to Pallister floating this idea, the Manitoba NDP came out and said they vigorously opposed to pipelines moving oil and gas to Hudson Bay, and they were in opposition. Now, fast forward to 2025.
Yeah.
And the premier meets with some EU officials and ambassadors who very much want energy exports, including natural gas, from Alberta to get to Europe. And he does another major backflip and now is openly musing about building a second port on Hudson Bay for the express purposes of transporting energy products. And he recently was asked by CBC, well, what about the issue about environmental spills?
Yes.
And his response was very revealing. He said, well, President in the White House is Donald Trump, and because of that, that sort of changes things, and that seems to now be the concern. And I know we've talked about this a little bit. Donald Trump is going to be out of office in 3.5, 4 years.
Very short-term thinking.
And you can't build a port in 4 years. You can't build a pipeline in 4 years.
No.
It takes way too long. And yet that's the thinking. And so I'm wondering what your response is about the Premier's flip-flop.
Very disappointing. I mean, I was pleased when he was supporting the Seal River watershed protection and talking about 30% by 2030. But this flip-flop really shows that where there's, I don't know, is it short-term profits? No, that's not a short-term profit thing. I really don't understand the lack of thinking and the lack of strategy behind that kind of flip-flop, because it's not good for our community. It's not good for our northern communities, something like that. There could be many, many ways that they're given employment and develop, and we develop our resources in a way that's not as environmentally damaging as a pipeline north to, and a second port. We have a lot of problems with the existing port that needs a lot of investment and a lot of health infrastructure, both socially and environmentally.
Right. So I want to talk a little about, you already raised about CO silica.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is something that's sort of in the NDP caucus we're sort of very passionate about. And basically, just for the listeners who may not know, this is an Alberta-based mining company that wants to bore holes into a freshwater aquifer and basically suction out pure silica sand. And initially, it appeared the sand that they wanted to use it for was for fracking. They've now changed that, and they're now saying it's for solar panels, although there's no solar panel manufacturing in Western Canada.
Exactly.
And at risk is potentially the contamination of the aquifer, and 70,000 Manitobans, this is their primary clean drinking water,
Yes.
let alone businesses, let alone farms, and if you get this wrong, it's devastating.
There's no going back.
Yeah.
There's no going back. No, I think their shift from fracking to solar panels is an excellent example of greenwashing,
Mm-hmm.
and the lack of honesty that they have demonstrated right from the beginning. They want short-term profits. I still think they want to get all of the permissions and then hand it off to somebody that actually knows something about mining, because they don't know anything about mining. And having reviewed, I create technical reports for a living as an organic verification officer. So having reviewed their reports, there were models based on mining that had nothing to do with what they want to do, Mark.
Yeah.
It was dreaming that they're somehow going to stop gravity from caving in the sides of these excavations. They're somehow going to fractured carbonate limestone and be able to seal it again so there wouldn't be multiple vectors for contamination of our drinking water. Like, forget that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just completely delusional when you start to look at it. And they were very disrespectful of us as a community group, and so was the province. We should have been granted intervenor status so that we could have
You're talking about the
they should have
Environment
paid.
Commission.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then when we finally pushed them to have a Clean Environment Commission hearing, the government did not insist that they pay for our experts. We had to sell our plants, our perennials, and hold bake sales to get the money to do that, which was ridiculous because they're planning to make money from a public good like our water system. And then they present these hypothetical models of what they think is going to happen without any kind of real risk analysis, without saying that a biologist could be in charge of the plan, not a hydrogeologist. This is complex hydrogeology we're talking about.
Yeah.
So at every level, their plan was compromised. And even to the fact of when I first debated Brent Bullen, I think his name was, on CJOB, he said, we want to be good neighbors. And I said, well, then why isn't there a gate and fencing around all this raw silica that you've pumped up and have in piles where I see kids' tire marks? Kids are playing in that, and that can give them silicosis. In 20 years, there could be a number of children from that Vivian area that have serious lung problems because of their lack of due diligence. And he said, oh, we put a gate up, but it was stolen. Well, I mean, was it a gate that hovered in the air, Mark? I was on that property. I inspect for a living. There was no ground disturbance. There was no gate installed there that was stolen. Right. So that fellow felt comfortable lying to my question on public radio.
Right.
I mean, it was CJOB, so it wasn't public radio. But you know what I mean, in the public, to the public.
Well, to the politics of this. I mean, I'm one of the last jobs when we were in opposition, I was the environment critic. So I had been in meetings with the Premier about the CO Silica mine proposal. And he always gave me the impression that he supported the project. And what I certainly heard from the environment minister at the time, once we were in government, is that the leader's office was putting incredible pressure on the environment minister to approve this project. And to her credit, she held fast and said no, because she obviously had her own concerns and saw whatever technical data they had seen.
Yes.
But then, sort of a stroke of luck, it comes out in the media that the PC party, after they've lost the election before the transition to the Kinew government, that former PC government ministers were trying to sort of push it through when they were in what's called the caretaker time between governments, which you just don't do major decisions between the transition from the old government to the new. And it's now being investigated by the ethics commissioner or whatever. And so, as you know, what happened as a result of that then gave the provincial government cover to say no to CO Silica. But I think you alluded to it. It wasn't no, it was not this proposal. And they certainly have left the door open for this to come back. So is the drinking water of 70,000 Manitobans in southeast Manitoba, is it safe?
I don't believe so. Not if they let CO Silica back in. They want to take out almost every day. They're proposing a well a day to take out sand the size of the Hotel Fort Garry. Without subsidence, you're going to take out that much sand and not have sinkholes? Folks, let me show you. In others in the States where they mine this silica sand, the sinkholes and the problems they have. I think they're just trying to find areas where they have minimum population, so there aren't enough people to protest, because we were able to motivate the people around Vivian and Enola to stand up against it. And I think they're trying to use some, I don't know what they're doing, but they're not being honest. And they're certainly not saying to CO, let's see a hydrogeologist analysis of this. Let's get a better project on the table. I personally think it's impossible to do it safely.
Yeah. So
but I'm not a hydrogeologist, you know?
So the Premier has a track record of flip-flopping, especially on environmental issues. And, you know, he's against something on one day and is for it the exact opposite the next day. Are you concerned about that with CO?
Yes. Absolutely. I think he could be looking for an opportunity. I don't know what they're doing with governments that they're so popular. I mean, dare I say there's some kind of resource exchange happening or some kind of promising that we don't know about. But with our current Environmental Act, we are not protected, fellow Manitobans. We are not protected from short-term profiteers who don't care what kind of mess they leave in their wake. Have we not seen, don't we have still 300 mine messes that's going to cost us as a public purse millions and millions and millions of dollars to clean up? Could we please learn from our experience, Mark?
Sure. Okay. Well, so I've been enjoying this, but I want to sort of go full circle here. So I don't think it's a big, strong statement to say that you believe we're in a climate emergency.
Yes, totally.
Right. So let's end this conversation. Give me the top 5 responses from the Green Party of how the Green Party responds to Manitoba's climate emergency.
Well, I think number one, with the housing that I was speaking to earlier, we need sustainable housing with sustainable heating. So heat exchangers, that's a wonderful new technology. So let's use the new technology that's around. Let's support. So that's the housing thing. Let's really give our medicine and our healthcare people the support they need in a way that is truly sustainable. So I think that we have to look at that. A green sort of prior to getting sick, we need to be working there, helping people access good local food. That's all my agricultural work. But also that's healthcare, Mark. Having local food, people have a higher quality of fresh food, then they're healthier, then they're not as damaged. So living in a safe, sustainable home, having the healthcare we need, having enough people employed, ensuring that we have I guess right in there would have to be Greens really talk about the importance of a basic income guarantee. We have to share the money that we have more equitably, and there's more than enough to do that if we would stop giving billions of dollars to petroleum companies. They are hooked on us, and we need to be less hooked on them. So it's not just our housing, it's also our transportation, it's also our power. We need green power. We need to be supporting Manitoba Hydro in being more green and not just giving them a carte blanche because electricity is a little bit better than coal. How they manage it and they manage the lake and those watersheds is still very, very important. And we can be a producer of electricity through sun, wind, and hydroelectricity all through the province. So there's that. The basic income guarantee, first past the post. I mean, we're going to continue to educate people. And I think there are more and more folks understanding that as long as we have this ping pong ball of might is right, those with the most votes wins, and that we need to all come together and have the kind of bridge building and discussions that you're seeking to have where we can hold governments accountable. As a small party, that we're not beholden to anyone. So we can speak truth to power. And people want that. We just have to encourage, let them know we're here. As you say, that's very important, and share our policies. So those are the ones that come to mind right away. I mean, for me, being in agriculture my whole life, living on a farm, working with farmers, I sometimes think people believe the grocery stores have replicators in the back, and we don't. So we need to be honoring our farm families here in Manitoba and our healthcare workers, because they are stressed to the max, and it's only going to increase.
Right. Well, Janine Gibson, the leader of the Manitoba Green Party, thank you very much for coming on the pod.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. Great questions, Mark. And I hope we can continue to work together because I think we've got a lot of overlap in our visions.
Okay, I look forward to it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So there's been lots of talk this week about education school property taxes, and I want to unpack the politics of this. As a former school trustee for the Winnipeg School Division, we lived and breathed education funding. So let me first explain what it is, why we have it, why it's become so political at the Ledge. So if you're a property owner, you pay two types of property tax. One from your municipality. So if you live in Winnipeg, that's from City of Winnipeg, which is set by City Council. Second type comes from the education property tax, and this is set by your local school division. And the combination of these two become your property taxes. And people often confuse those, and they think the City of Winnipeg charges both, which they don't. Now, where this gets complicated is the province of Manitoba is responsible for funding education. Now, at one time, the province paid for 80% of school funding, and the remaining 20% came from education school property tax. Now, provincial politicians began underfunding education about 20 years ago, and they would only raise their portion of the funding bill with the rate of commercial inflation, not the actual rate that the school boards were facing. So I'll give you an example. If the inflation in Manitoba is 1.3%. That's how much gas, groceries, and mortgages would go up in a year. Then the province would give 1.3% of new money to the school boards. But here's the problem. 80% of a school board's budget is salaries. And most unionized contracts at this time had cost of living increases at least 2% a year. And with the other normal costs of school boards going up, most school boards were facing increases of about 3.5% a year, and they were getting half that from the province. Now, they would, over time, fill the gap by raising education property taxes, and they've been raising steadily over the past 20 years. So in places like Pembina Trails, that started out with an 80-20 split, meaning the province paid 80% of the bill, your property taxes paid 20. It's now dropped to below 50%, meaning that you pay more of your kids' school funding through property taxes, and less than 50% actually comes from the province. Now, Winnipeg has in itself about 7 school divisions. Each one has a different tax rate, and some charge more than others. And conversely, each of the 7 different school divisions offer different services. So you can get more services in a higher tax school division than in a lower tax school division. And it varies wildly. One of the things that we encountered at the Winnipeg School Division is we would spend about $80 million a year on special needs funding for students. The divisions around us did not. They did not put that kind of money in. And in fact, parents, we would hear stories that in those divisions outside the Winnipeg School Division, if they had a special needs child and if they were advocating for that child, asking for more services, the response they would get from their school division is go move to the Winnipeg School Division. So I don't think anybody would think that the system is working or that's fair or that's a reasonable response to a parent. But here's the politics of it. It is a Pandora's box to reform education school taxes. There will be winners, there will be losers. Politically, nobody wants to spend that capital to take on that fight. So this is a taxation system that desperately needs reform. Every government says this, no government touches it. And so things are now getting worse under Kinew, and he's continued to underfund education. The difference is he's allowed school divisions to make up for that underfunding by allowing them to raise taxes. And it's been reported this year that school taxes have gone up anywhere from 10 to 25%, depending on the division. And that's a huge shock. So in my time in politics, I've never seen increases like that at the school board level. So let's get into the politics of this. Now, Brian Pallister, if you remember him, he wanted to get rid of school trustees, school boards, and he wanted to control education from the ledge. His own MLAs were against the plan. School boards are often the only head office in a small town, the only source of white-collar jobs. It brings millions of economic activity to rural Manitoba, and most of all, local residents get a say in how their kids' schools are run. So the argument that Pallister used at the time was disingenuous. He said that school boards were top-heavy and inefficient, and they spent too much on administration. In fact, that's always been false. School boards are very lean. Their administration costs were capped at 3%, which is lower than any municipality or provincial government. In fact, they are way better and more efficient run than the province has ever been. The other argument was also troubling. The Pallister government would demonize superintendents. These were the CEOs of the school divisions, and they would make salaries in the range of, $200,000 to $300,000. And the premier thought that was scandalous. Keep in mind that that's more than the premier makes. So this is the market rate. This is the head of the Winnipeg School Division. They have 6,000 employees, a $420 million budget, 33,000 students, over 80 buildings that they have to look over. If they were in the private sector, they would be making many times what they make. But you couldn't help notice that the Pallister government had a particular problem with superintendents because most of these CEOs are women, and there was always a gendered element to his criticism. So, I think it was the Brian Pallister government telling on themselves. But what did he do about it? He did a couple things. He capped the amount a school board could raise taxes in a year. And that led to a bit of a crisis because his government underfunded the provincial portion. So what that meant is the province wasn't sending enough money to the school boards. School boards couldn't raise enough money to backfill the difference. And so they had to cut. And cut they did. Larger class sizes, program cuts, less rigorous education for children. 20 years ago, we had teacher librarians in all our schools. We had nurses in all our schools. We had lab technicians in our science classes. All those are virtually gone in most schools nowadays. And the services that you get now are a fraction of what they would get 20 years ago. He then took away school trustees' power to tax. So he set tax levels at the ledge. And again, Manitobans effectively lost democratic control over their schools. So what happened next? Well, you guessed it. It meant more cuts to education. So this turned out to be Brian Pallister's undoing. In fact, these changes led to the NDP polling above the PCs. After Pallister started his attacks on school boards, the polling numbers flipped and the NDP went in the lead and they never looked back. And then, of course, Heather Stephenson then takes office. She immediately starts repealing some of the Pallister education financing agenda, knowing that it was very unpopular. And she brings in a 50% rebate. Now, what that is school boards would tax you, but the province of Manitoba would give you 50% rebate for whatever property that you got taxed. And if you own multiple mansions or properties, you would get a rebate for each property, and commercial properties would also get a rebate. This was highly expensive and cost Manitobans dearly. It created a deficit situation. And eventually they pledged they were going to get rid of education property tax altogether. But most importantly, it was extremely unfair. Rebates for both residential and commercial property meant that massive out-of-province landlords like Cadillac Fairview, who own Polo Park Mall, were getting million-dollar checks from the government. It was a huge corporate giveaway. And Manitoba was running a deficit, so that meant they had to borrow this money to cut a Toronto mega corporation $1 million check. Now, and those 50% rebate checks didn't distinguish if you lived in a tiny starter home or you had a 7-car garage mega mansion. In fact, Brian Pallister at the time did have a very large mansion, and he was eligible to receive $8,000 back a year on his education property taxes, and he's clearly somebody who could afford to pay that tax. When you look at the average Manitoban under that scheme, they would be saving about $500. So what this tax scheme was, it ended up being a huge wealth transfer to rich property owners. And if you own multiple properties, multiple homes, you got a check for each and every one of them. So made our tax system less fair, incredibly expensive, and it basically caused deficits and made no sense at all. So the Kinew government comes in. And in opposition, we had been railing about this for years. We attacked the previous government for sending checks to out-of-province billionaires. There was a huge deficit, and the Kinew government promised to get rid of it within 4 years. They needed revenue, and they changed this scheme. So the commercial rebates were dropped, so no more checks for Cadillac Fairview, and the rebates were capped. First at $1,500 a year, then $1,600 a year, which meant you could only claim a rebate on your principal residence, and you could only get a maximum $1,500 back. And the idea is that most lower and middle class homes, that's the amount that they would pay, so they'd end up paying nothing. And if you had a home that was more expensive than that because it was worth more, the presumption is that you could afford to pay more, and so there was an element of progressivity to the tax bill. But here's where the controversy comes in. What the government didn't take into account is property reassessment. Every 2 years, the value of your house gets reassessed, and if your property has gone up in value, it gets taxed at a higher rate. If you're in your house, even though you may not be getting richer, your job pays the same, but the value of your property gets richer every year, meaning that when you sell it, you're going to cash out and do very well. But this is bad for working people or young people who can't get into the market because homes are becoming too expensive to buy. Now, the Kinew government doesn't have an answer for that. They don't have any policies to make housing more affordable, but that's a story for another day. But how this affects school taxes is that your modest home is going up in price. And basically, if you're in the right neighborhood at the right time and you bought it at the right year, it's basically like winning the lottery, because when you sell it, you're going to get way more for that house than you actually bought it. But in the short term, your school taxes are going up based on the value of that house. And if your house has been modest in 1 year, but now is raised in price, it's no longer considered a modest house, that $1,500 rebate isn't going to cut it. And in fact, in the city of Winnipeg, 130,000 homes are now above that threshold. Now, when Kinew government announced this policy, they claimed that 80% of Manitobans would be better off under their plan. And with those numbers, 130,000, it doesn't look that is in fact true. Here is the politics of it. People hate school taxes. They don't understand them, and many don't have children or grandchildren in the schools, and they take the view, why should I have to pay? Seniors are hurt by this. They may own their house outright. They bought it when it was very, very cheap. They live on a fixed income, and any yearly increases because their house is jumping up in price, it becomes unaffordable for them. Now, elections in Manitoba are won and lost in about 7-10 ridings that ring the outer suburbs of Winnipeg. And it's exactly those neighborhoods that are going to see huge reassessments where their homes are climbing in price. People don't realize they're actually getting richer. They don't feel richer. They will when they sell, but they have no interest in actually selling. They got to live there. And so they're reacting to the steep jump in the current tax bill. In these strategic ridings, and both parties have to win them, people are now opening up their tax bill and they're seeing huge jumps. And keep in mind, Winnipeg and other municipalities who have also been underfunded by the province have increased their taxes by a huge jump. Winnipeg by about a 20-year high. And all this is happening at the same time when we're facing an affordability crisis. Now, the Kinew government is also imposing austerity policies to pay down the deficit. So they're ignoring the affordability crisis while they're doing this, and it's basically a perfect storm. So keep in mind, Kinew needs to win the outer suburbs to form government. PCs need to win those same seats to get back in government. And these are the people getting hit hardest by these tax increases. So the battle lines are drawn. So Obicon has brought focus, energy, and pointed attacks in the ledge, and the morale in the ledge has completely shifted to the PCs. When you see them in the House, they're excited and energized. The Kinew's bench seems bitter, angry, demoralized. There's been a real sea change in the last 18 months. Con has been hitting the government hard daily, reading letters from constituents with shocking stories of seeing their taxes go up 25% this year. And it's effective and it's working. And the Kinew government seems lost. They have no response and no leadership, and they can't seem to defend their own policy. So here's what's good about this policy. The Kinew government's policy is way fairer than the Pallister policy, but it's not fair enough. And it needs to take into account seniors and those on low income with fixed incomes. And so here is some solutions that would actually improve things for Manitobans. One of the solutions are called scrip taxes. So as a senior or low-income resident, you would be able to defer paying your taxes, and a lien would get put onto your property. And at the time you sell your property, you settle up with the province, who take their deferred taxes first, and then you get the remaining value of the property. They do this in BC and elsewhere. So this allows seniors and low-income families to stay in their home and yet pay their tax bills and not have to dig deep for those increases. Second thing is actually tackling the root of the problem. That's the continued underfunding education system in Manitoba. We have to get back to the province paying 80% of education funding and only relying on 20% from school boards for local projects and local initiatives. It's a safeguard. It allows local communities to properly fund their children's schools, even if you have a government like the Pallister Kinew government that isn't committed to education and continues to underfund it. And school funding has to rise every year at the rate of school board inflation, not the rate of commercial inflation, so we don't get back into this mess. And third, our property tax system needs to be even more progressive. We need higher rates for mansions. Property taxes are a wealth tax, and a wealth tax we have always had in Manitoba. But right now, it's essentially flat, which means that we currently have a tax which is unfair to lower and middle-class Manitobans, and we need a functional, true wealth tax that ensures that middle and low-income families are not paying it, while those who are wealthy can. So let's get back to Wab Kinew's response. This has been a great issue for the PCs. The Kinew government seems lost. They don't have a response. In fact, it was interesting. It was telling he was in Toronto the other day at a photo op with the Premier of Ontario. He had been avoiding media in Manitoba. He clearly didn't want to answer questions on the property tax issue. He doesn't have a good response. And the media had been hounding him for an answer, and he got away to Toronto, and he must have felt safe. And a Toronto CP reporter, on behalf of a Manitoba CP reporter, asked him questions about the property tax issue. The Premier was livid, refused to answer the question, and lectured the reporter. None of that was a good look on the Premier, and it doesn't show confidence or a sense of mastery or control over this issue. But here's Kinew's dilemma. He's trying very hard to rebrand the Manitoba NDP into another sort of basic conservative party. He's very clearly influenced by Doug Ford's PC model of government, and he's borrowing heavily from it. But if you are a conservative party, the assumption you always start with is all taxes are bad. If you are a progressive party, you don't have that same assumption. You don't love taxes, and especially if they're being imposed on working people or poor people, but you understand that you have to tolerate them in order to collectively pay for the things that make communities and make life worth living. So the idea of fair taxation is what progressives are concerned about, and that is something we need to build in Manitoba in order to pay for the services that we all enjoy and make our society safe and livable. So in opposition, that was very much the messaging. The Manitoba NDP talks about the tax system being unfair under the PCs and that we were giving basically a huge gift to the wealthy. But now in government, now sort of taking on right-wing ideas about all taxes are bad, Kinew can't say that. And without being able to say that, he can't defend what his government has done. He's basically accepted the frame of his opponents that all taxes are bad. And once you do that, you've now lost the political debate. So the NDP premier cannot defend an NDP government policy, and that's where we are. And if it stays that way, Abhi Khan and his PCs are going to continue to feast on this government. So I want to thank you again for joining us on our fourth edition of the Ledge podcast. We'd love to hear from you. I want to thank again Janine Gibson, who appeared on the podcast, and for a very interesting interview. We're on all your social media channels, and you can reach us by email at mark@markwasiliumla.ca. And if you have any comments about the show or any podcast ideas, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you.